Welcome back to Citizen Development Live. I am your host, Neil Miller. Today, our guest is Debbie Yarosh. She is the manager of automation engineering at a large fintech company. Debbie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's very exciting. You got a lot of rich experience I want to dive into, and let's really just start there. Tell us a little bit about your history and your history of equipping business people with these advanced automation tools.
Sure. So first, I'm a software engineer by trade, so I've got over 30 years of experience delivering automation or software solutions.
Hmm.
And for about the last 10 years or so, I've been primarily in the robotic process automation or RPA space. Um, I fell in love with automation when I can't say I fell in love with it immediately when I was first introduced to RPA. When I was first introduced to it, it was like, this
Uh,
is beneath me. I'm a software engineer. I don't need to use this kind of tool. But then I discovered the kinds of problems that could be solved with RPA and the
mm,
power of automating things in manual business workflows that um, really have never been able to be automated before. And by heart, I'm a problem solver. And so when I discovered the power of the tool, I just fell in love with automation. And so I've been on this automation journey for like the last, 10 years. And so one of the big things for me with the automation tools is this idea of I really believe that companies need to embrace automation to stay competitive.
mm,
The companies that don't embrace automation are going to fall behind, and automation is really, really powerful. The RPA space has really exploded and provides a lot of good tools out there for um, doing the automation of the manual business processes. But there's other tools out there, uh, that will also help with automation. So when I'm talking about automation, I'm talking about any of the tools out there that help automate workflows that typically won't get done by IT because they have higher priority things.
yeah. Could you help us for people who are less familiar when you talk about RPA? Like, how would you classify the different types of automations? Can you help us understand the landscape?
Sure. So from an RPA perspective, there's two really main types of automations. There's the unattended and the attended. And the way I like to describe it is I like to describe the unattended automations as being digital workers. They're basically an extension of your workforce. And so an unattended automation is where you automate a workflow that an employee or a contractor or basically that a human is doing, and then you automate that workflow and you turn it over to a digital worker. The power of that is that the digital worker will do the task the same way every single time, whereas humans will deviate from the way the task should be performed. It's funny how many times I've worked with process owners on getting the information for how, a workflow that they want to automate and get an understanding of it. And then once we start talking to the SME, meaning the person who is doing the work every single day, to discover like, oh, well, we don't do it that way. We do it this way. And the
Right.
process owner doesn't even know that their employees aren't following the guidelines that were laid out for doing the automation. So with RPA, the power of it is that a, once you automate a workflow, it's going to do that workflow the same way every single time. So there won't be any deviation. And then, more importantly, where the real power comes in is that once you train one digital worker to perform a task, any digital worker can perform that task.
Hmm.
So it really becomes an extension of your workforce. And I really like to drive that home with my process owners and the business because a couple of things happen when you talk about automation. One, immediately when you start talking about automating workflows that people are doing, people think that they're going to automatically lose their job. Okay. And
Hmm.
that's going to take my job away. And what I like to point out is that automation can actually help stabilize your workforce. So, in other words, what will happen is, especially in like mortgage industry,
Sure.
companies when interest rates are low are scrambling to find people to handle the increased transactions. But then when interest rates rise, those people get laid off. So
Mm,
when you automate businesses such as, workflows in businesses such as that, it really helps to stabilize your workforce because when interest rates are low, you just add more digital workers. And when interest rates go high, you just turn them off. They don't care. Um, and then the other important thing is that it allows the employees to focus on the more interesting parts of their job. So the thing to keep in mind when we talk about automation is that although with AI, it's making inroads into being able to do critical thinking and make decisions based on critical thinking, it's not really completely there yet. And so when we talk about automating, we're really talking about automating the mundane aspects of your job. You
mm,
know, sitting there and copying data from one system into another system, pulling reports, and then formatting the data into for another report. Those are really the kinds of things that we're talking about. And as far as with this podcast being citizen development focused, it actually helps to it actually helps to facilitate citizen development with these RPA tools because the RPA tools are typically a low code, no code platform, meaning you don't
right.
have to have a background in software development in order to use them, which is one of the things that makes them so powerful.
Hmm. Well, let's dive into. You talked about IT teams working with businesses together. A lot of times, the business has, almost an endless number of requests they need to be done, but the IT team is limited on how much they can create and make things new. So, what are some examples of some applications and automations, even on a smaller scale, that IT will just never be able to prioritize, but they still make a big impact on process owners?
So that's a really interesting question. And the answer really depends on the business and even down to the group within the business. What is impactful for one company may not, from an IT perspective, may not be impactful for another company. So, for example, take a finance department.
Hmm.
If the month end close process is very intensive, there's a lot that needs to get done, and they're trying to do it in a reasonable amount of time. So if senior leadership says that we need to automate the month end close to improve the data and decrease the time that it takes to do month end close, then they might charge IT with taking on that problem and coming up with a solution.
Right.
But if they don't, then it's still a problem and it's still a benefit for the finance company, or I'm sorry, the finance department. And so therefore having a way of allowing them to get that automation done without using IT resources can have a huge impact. Um, if you talk to anybody that is in a company that has to worry about month end close, which is basically every finance department in a company, month end is very stressful. They
Hmm.
usually are working a lot of hours to get all the data that they need to compile the reports and all that kind of stuff. And if there was a way to do that process where it wasn't as stressful for them, that they were able to focus on the important part of the job, which is analyzing the data and making sure that the data is correct, as opposed to gathering the data and all that kind of stuff, then you end up with, better reporting, and you can decrease the time that it takes because a lot of the tasks that they may be doing now could be done off hours. So, in other words, think of it this way: if you have to gather all these reports and it takes you a couple of hours to do it, wouldn't it be great as a finance person at month end that you walk in, the week that you have to start working on month end, and all those reports are sitting there for you?
Hmm.
And wouldn't it be great if not only all those reports were sitting there for you, but they were also consolidate it and manipulate it and whatever way that you normally would do to throw them into another, let's say, Excel spreadsheet, so that now all you have to do is go and start looking at the data and make sure that it looks reasonable, or to look into something when something looks off and be able to do the detective work, is the way I like to describe it.
Hmm.
Again, I think that people would find that work much more interesting than spending the hours gathering the reports, having to copy the data into Excel spreadsheets and things like that. And so
Yeah.
when we talk about automation, automation encompasses a lot of different tools. So this example that I just gave you with the finance could also, involve RPA going out and grabbing all the reports. It might be an integration where a job runs that grabs all the reports. The data could be an Excel macro that gets run that will do the consolidating and the formatting and all that kind of stuff. So automation can encompass a lot of different tools to solve the problem, which ultimately the problem is better data close faster. So
Yeah.
that's where the power of you know automation comes in for these workflows that IT will never prioritize. Another example that I think is really a good example is that um, take a mortgage company, for example, right?
Hmm.
A lot of mortgage companies use a third party loan origination system. Okay. They don't necessarily have their own homegrown system. And so what ends up happening is that when the third party systems or the loan origination systems have updates, the they usually happen on a quarterly basis. And if the LOS is customized for your particular company, when those updates come in, hundreds of hours are spent um, testing the new release to make
Sure.
sure that it doesn't break anything, doesn't break any of your customizations and things like that. And then when the problem is found, it has to go back to the company. They have to fix it. You get another update, and then you have to go through that testing again. So hundreds of hours are spent doing that. And IT departments typically, when they're working on their own systems, the ones that they've developed, they'll create their own regression tests because they know how important it is. But when we're talking about third party systems, they don't have the time because they're working on more important things like adding features to their systems and stuff like that. So by going through and automating this regression testing, um, again, thinking in terms of who's going to do it. Well, the business can do it. Using a low code, no code platform really helps to make that happen. And I did this in a previous company that I worked for that was a mortgage company. And we automated those regression tests. We saved hundreds of hours every quarter. We were able to find issues with the release sooner because we did the automated regression test. And therefore, deploying the new release into our production environments was quicker because we found things faster. They got fixed faster. We were able to test faster. And by the way, that was done using business analysts to do to create those regression tests using, an RPA tool.
Yeah. Debbie, what's been your journey in terms of you said you started off as a software developer. You've been there, but yet you also have built up these skills of business. Like you understand what a loan origination system looks like. You understand how a finance department looks like. Was that difficult for you? And speak to others who are kind of standing in the gap between this
Sure.
world.
So I am what people would consider a generalist. I have experience across a large number of industries.
Hmm.
And every time I step into a new industry, I need to come up to speed on what's going on, what are the problems that need to be solved. One of my strengths, and this is something that I encourage everybody that all of the software engineers that have been on my teams and that I've mentored, I encourage them to become problem solvers. And
Hmm.
so the idea is you want to learn how to solve problems. And in order to solve problems, you have to understand what the problem is. And so you have to develop communication skills. You have to be able to understand what you know and don't know. And a lot of times, what I say is when I walk into a new industry, I think one of the strongest things that I bring to the table is the fact that I don't know that industry. And so I'm constantly asking why. And so when I walk in and they have a problem that they want to solve and they're saying, well, this is how we would do it, or this is how we want to do it, my question is why? Well, because of whatever. Well, why? And invariably, it always ends up coming down to, well, it's because we've always done it that way. And
Hmm.
so then the next question is that, okay, do you have to continue to do it that way? And so by having conversations like that with the business and my business partners, that really helps to identify what the problem is. And a lot of times what ends up happening is that you find out that the problem that the business is trying to solve or that they want to solve may not be the right problem. It may be a
Mm,
totally different problem that if they focus on that, not only will it solve the problem that they think that they have to solve, but it will solve a whole lot more. And so from that perspective, I really think it's being willing to learn. You have to be willing to learn. Being willing to ask the question why, and being willing to admit that, look, I don't know the answer. If something, if a question comes up and you don't have an answer, to be able to say, I don't have the answer, but I know how to get it. And
mm.
then you get the answer and then you go back. So I think that that's a really important thing. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've been so successful in this automation space.
Yeah, that's great advice. I like that. Thinking about being a problem solver, right? It's good.
Yeah.
Uh,
And the thing is the other thing with automation, and especially with in the RPA space, is it's really, really important for the the company to understand that there is a significant difference between traditional RP or traditional IT development and RPA development. Whereas with traditional IT development, you're given a problem to solve and you have the flexibility of deciding how you want to solve that problem. And so the idea being that with RPA, you don't have that. In other words, you're automating a manual business process. And so if there's 10 steps in that business process, you can't just arbitrarily decide that you want to do step 7, 8, and 9 before you do step 1, 2, and 3. So you really have to understand the business process that you're automating. And typically, with companies that do automations, they'll spin up a team to work on doing automations. Well, that team is not an expert. They may start out being an expert in the area where they start doing automations, but as the company expands in their journey of automating, your team is not going to understand every area of the business. And
right.
so understanding that difference and understanding that it takes time to get the requirements, it takes time for us to understand what the manual business process is that we're automating. That's a really important thing that the business itself or the company itself has to understand, because otherwise they might be like, well, why is it taking so long, or why can't you go faster? And it's like, well, we have to get this information, especially in agile companies that practice agile. With agile, a lot of it is, less documentation and more delivery. Well, again, with RPA, we need that documentation.
Right.
We can't automate something that we don't understand what the steps are. And so sometimes that's a challenge with companies that don't understand the difference between traditional IT development and, RPA.
Yeah, I like that. Let's change a little bit. Talk about the idea of app ownership, or whenever somebody from a business creates something, whether it be RPA or through low code or something like that. Um, there comes a point either when that application gets too complicated, or that person leaves the company, or they want to make some big changes they don't know how to do, and invariably their choices go to the IT team because they're supposed to be the ones that know all these things. But if we're doing a citizen development program, you might have dozens, you might have hundreds of these applications that are out there. How do you negotiate those types of things of working with those two?
So it's funny that you're bringing that up, because I have that exact situation in my current company. When I joined, we had a platform called QuickBase that is basically a database that allows you to develop easy forms and stuff like that and workflows. And the person that did a large number of these applications left the company.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came in and now I'm the owner of the platform, but there's all of these applications out there that now all of a sudden started breaking because his email was tied to a lot of the connections and things like that. And so, um, boom, everything starts breaking. So one of the ways to one of the ways that you really have to deal with citizen development is, prior to starting a citizen development program, you really need to put a governance model in place. All
Mm-hmm.
right. And the governance model is going to do things like identify how you're going to get requests for citizen development. All right. You should never have a program where, for example, let's say somebody needs a license to do, to work on the platform. So if they get that license and then just start going off willy-nilly developing things, you don't know what they're doing, and you don't know if what they're doing actually is beneficial or harmful. And so having a governance model in place where they have to put the request in for what they want to do, um, that it gets approved by, let's say, their supervisor, again, to make sure that they're not going off and doing something that the supervisor doesn't want them to do or doesn't think should be done. Also, from the perspective of with that governance model, when a request comes in, you'll be able to know whether or not there's already an IT initiative that's going to address whatever the pain point is that they're trying to automate. And so you don't want them spending time automating something that's going to be addressed.
Hmm.
And then with a governance model, you get to identify what requests are going to be done. You know who the let's say call it the developer of that's going to implement the solution, but you also know who the process owner is. In other words, who's approving this, who is saying that they want this to be automated.
Right.
Along with that, you can establish what your best practices are, and you can establish what documentation must be provided as part of the solution so that when it is deployed and is running in production, if somebody leaves the company, then um, again, let's use a finance group. Somebody develops something in finance, they're running it, and they leave, and now somebody else needs to run it. Then that process owner should understand what that process was to begin with, so that they know that they need to train somebody on that process. If the process owner leaves and the person that developed it left, then IT needs to have information on what that process is so that they can make sure that the next person that comes in can be trained and things like that. So
Yeah.
having a really good governance model is key to having a successful citizen development program.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, too often you start off with like, hey, letting loose a tool or not even knowing that it's there, but it's there, and then having to tie in a governance model afterwards. So I like the idea of making sure it's in place and but at the early part.
Say in my situation, I walked into a situation where they had citizen development but no governance model.
Mm,
And so one of the things that I had to do, and it wasn't a popular decision, excuse me, but it was what was best for the company, is to temporarily put a halt on all citizen development until that governance model was in
mm,
place.
yeah, that's a hard call. Uh, to close up, let's talk about the importance of choosing the right platform from the beginning. Because, like you said, you might be stepping into a situation. You got to think about how this is going to scale, how many people are going to use it. What are some tips you would give to people if they're in the early part of this journey about how to choose their right platform?
Um, it's really important that you do choose the right platform because choosing the wrong platform could affect your ability to have people adopt it and be enthusiastic about doing citizen development. Um, One of the top criteria that I think for choosing a platform is its ease of use. Is it
Mm-hmm.
user friendly? How difficult is it for a non-technical person to learn the tool and to start using it? The What goes hand in hand with that is the support and training that the tool provides. So the a lot of the big RPA tools, for example, and automation tools in general will have their own quote unquote universities where you can go and get free training.
Right.
Those tools are fantastic because it's easy to set up a training schedule, to identify the training that somebody should go through before they're allowed to start using the tool and things like that. And it's cost effective because it doesn't cost you anything to learn how to use the tool. So that would be number one. Number one and number two. The third thing would be integration capabilities. How
Mm,
easily does the platform integrate with other systems and data sources? So again, when you think of other systems, I'm not just talking about like Excel, or Google Sheets or Word or PDFs, but also other systems like SAP or Salesforce, or even more importantly, your own homegrown systems.
Right.
how can they integrate with them? How easy is it to work with those systems on the tool? So I think that that's another big factor that you have to take into consideration. Um, and then cost effectiveness is important because you want to make sure that from the model perspective, depending on how large you want your citizen development program to go or grow, you want to make sure that the cost model is effective. So in other words, you don't want to be spending all this money on licenses and not having automations that are going to give you a positive ROI on that expenditure. So that
Yeah.
again becomes part of having a good strong governance model is that you can control that to make sure that you don't just give everybody in the company, a license to do citizen development. You start off small, you give a few critical people the ability to do it, and then you start expanding out from there. The other thing, lastly, is governance and compliance. A tool that will help support whatever your governance and compliance, um, you know, uh, rules are, makes it easier to make sure that governance and compliance are being met. If you have to do that manually, then that makes it harder. And then again, as you say, if you've got a lot of programs out there that are citizen development programs, that can be very time consuming just to stay on top of the governance of those if you don't have a tool that will help implement your policies.
And that's really great advice. I love all that. Just thinking through all the things you need to have in place. Ease of use, obviously, very important. The integrations, the governance piece, I think, is a piece that a lot of tools are just now adding on. So that's great to hear your perspective on those.
So there's just one last thing that I want to mention when you talk about citizen development, and especially around fintech companies.
Mm-hmm.
As a fintech company, you have to abide by the Sarbanes-Oxley regulations, also known
Right.
as SOX. And citizen development for a fintech company is very, very challenging because of the SOX regulations. So
Mm-hmm.
again, it's not that you can't do it. You just have to be very strict in how you implement it. And I recommend highly that you get your internal audit team involved early in the process to make sure that the governance model that you put in place is going to support compliance, the SOX compliance, and not, um, you know, be non-compliant. And so that's something that's really, really important and can be a challenge for fintech companies.
Definitely. That's a great point to end on there. Well, Debbie, thanks so much for being on this show. We learned a lot from you. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and everything you've learned over the years.
Thank you for having me.